All right, so talking about our little peppered moths here. If you look at the F1 generation, meaning they've already been mixed up, you're going to have some individuals in the population that are homozygous dominant, heterozygous, and homozygous recessive. And they've actually done the math on the frequency. So if you can think about it, 4% is homozygous dominant, 32% is heterozygous, and 64% is homozygous recessive and light colored. For the next generation, we're going to see that change. So this is just the normal frequency of random mating occurred, no pressure to change over time, no pressure that some live and some die based on their coloring, okay? So this is just how it would work if there was no selective pressure. And over time, it would kind of start settling in. For Hardy-Weinberg, this is what I want you to know kind of conceptually, okay? This is kind of saying when change won't happen. These are the conditions that need to occur so that the gene pool, the frequencies of all those alleles remain constant, in equilibrium. All 5 of these conditions have to be met. 1, there cannot be any random mutations. 2, there's no gene flow. We'll talk about that in a minute. 3, there has to be random mating. No selection, sexual selection. 4, no genetic drift. We'll talk about that in a minute. And 5, no natural selection, meaning there's no pressure of one phenotype being better than the other based on the environment. So hopefully you can see that these 5 conditions are pretty much never met, and if they are met, they're met for a very short amount of time in a very stable population, a stable environment. So these are rarely, if ever, met, okay? Because one of those things, one of those 5 conditions, if not multiple of those conditions, do occur. And so that's kind of the flip side of Hardy-Weinberg is this is why evolution occurs, because those 5 stabilizing factors can't be done in nature. Okay? And so by looking at it on the flip side, we can see that these are the opposite of those factors is what causes evolution. So kind of going back again, mutations cause evolution, gene flow causes evolution, sexual selection, not just random mating, but purposefully knowing who you're reproducing with. Genetic drift causes evolution, natural selection causes evolution, okay? So we can show that evolution is happening mathematically by doing that equation, that Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium equation. And we can do it at the beginning and at the end, and we can see how the frequencies of the dominant and the recessive allele has changed over time. So obviously, going back to our factory, our industrial revolution example, over time there was an increase of the dark phenotype. Because of the pollution, there was soot darkening the tree trunks and killing off the light-colored lichens that flake on the tree. And so, because of this, in this short amount of time, about 25 years, we see that almost no light moths were found in the population. This was back in the 1800s, but they still were collecting this data, and now we can use it in retrospect to kind of look at the allele frequencies, right? And that change over time of the white light-colored moth being more common, and then after 20 years, the dark-colored moth being more common. They're still the same species. They can still reproduce with one another, but because of that natural selection, we see that change over time has occurred, that microevolution has occurred. So again, flipping this on the head of Hardy-Weinberg, any condition that deviates from keeping that equilibrium, happy world of Hardy-Weinberg will cause evolutionary change. Okay? So, 1, we're going to go through each one, and I'm going to try to do it in the next 10 minutes. So let's talk about genetic mutations. An example would be Freckles. Oh, look at that cute little boy. He could be mine, that's for sure. This is really the start for allele differences. We have to have that genetic change at the beginning. So without any mutations, we really would just be mixing up the genes generation to generation. Mutations is what causes that new genotype to pop into the gene pool and possibly a new phenotype. Okay? So this is really the beginning of the story of evolution, right? That we need kind of this constant influx of random mutations that occur. However, it's that next part that when there is some kind of value to that adaptation to survival or some other bit of being able to survive, whether it means getting a mate, getting resources, or whatever, that is what's going to flip the script a little bit, and now all of a sudden that random mutation serves as an advantage to the population. So that's a good place to start. We've talked about it before. So here's gene flow. I keep saying, hey, we're going to talk about it later. Now is the time. So gene flow is also called gene migration. So again, of course, genes themselves do not move, but it is this idea of tracing the movement of alleles through a population as they spread out through migration, right? And mixing with other populations of that same species. And so by mixing the genes from one population to another, we increase the variation because now there can be new combinations of alleles. Okay? So this actually brings more variation to the population, but doesn't allow that isolation that's necessary for speciation. So this can prevent the division into a different species, which we're going to talk about in the next lecture. Okay, so the idea that, we can think about human population. Before we could travel well around this world, we had our own little pockets of gene pools, right? If you want to think about the British Isles, Japan, Africa, North America, South America, we were all kind of keeping to our own gene pools. But then once we started traveling, we can follow this gene flow, and we can do it now, and how blood types moved, how it started in one area and spread out as people spread and started reproducing with other people. Okay? We can look at this at animals as well. So this is an example of a few different types of snakes, and how there's a variety of coloration. They all share, even though they're not the same species, they do share the same genes that come from coloration of their scales. And we can see how there's little pockets of different colors and how others kind of spread throughout. Okay, so the next part that causes, one other cause of evolution, so we talked about genetic mutations and gene flow. The third is non-random mating. Because here's the thing, in the real world, many species, it's not random. It's not, hey, I'm in heat, you're in heat, we're next to each other, let's get it on, right? Instead, many times there's a bit of decision, maybe not super conscious, but decision in who to select to reproduce with. Okay? And so assortative mating means that you usually mate with somebody who looks like you, okay? And their homozygous combinations will increase, dominant or recessive, but that's what we see over time. So that's one option, right? So instead of it just being random chance of who you reproduce with someone who looks like you. Again, don't think humans on this. These are animal ideas too. Sexual selection means that there are certain traits that are sought after. Okay, we kind of talked about the idea of the peacock, right? Females will choose the males with the longest and most eyes in their tail. Because obviously, and they're not thinking this consciously, it's all kind of instinct. It's already part of them that's how they choose. It's very interesting. But they've run studies where they've taken a very, very healthy male and clipped all the eyes off, and females will not reproduce with him. Don't worry, the eyes grow back. But obviously it takes a lot of energy to grow a tail that's long and heavy, and you survive long enough from all the tigers chasing you. So if you can grow that nice of a tail, you must have a lot of good traits that would be lovely to have in the next generation. Okay? The next one is genetic drift. This is kind of interesting. It happens. This is when, and we talked about this a little bit in the airplane, sometimes there's just a random chance. There's something super random that occurs, that instead of the ones that have the best traits to survive, it's really just who is at a certain location at a certain time. And so sometimes we get these weird phenotypes that pop out, and they're not really best suited for the environment, but they're good enough, right? This usually happens in small populations, and these are the ones that are most likely that rare alleles just kind of disappears. There's two types of genetic drift that I'm going to talk about. One's the bottleneck effect, and one's the founder effect. And we've talked about both of these kind of in general. Okay, so let's say we've got some froggies, and most of them are green, 90% of them are green, and 10% of them are brown. But if there's a natural disaster, and these get swept off, 5 of the green frogs are gone. They were in the wrong place at the wrong time. It's not that they had fewer advantageous traits. They got swept up in a storm surge. Well, now all of a sudden, even though it's still that same brown frog, he's now representing 20% of the population. So it's just a random chance that kind of wipes out part of the population that's independent of their traits. Bottleneck effect, and we always talk about the cheetahs. Bottleneck effect is when we're in a very small population, probably near extinction. And so when we come down to it, there's just this very tiny population that can reproduce for the next generation. That's inbreeding. Very, very often it's inbreeding because the only ones that are surviving are brothers and sisters and cousins of each other. And so since they have very similar, that becomes a very shallow genetic variation, right? And if they have good traits, awesome, because obviously they've survived, but at the same time, those recessive traits that could be harmful. And in the case of cheetahs in the wild, they have such a small population, they are very, very genetically similar. They actually stop being able to reproduce. And again, that's just one of these interesting things about inbreeding, that over time, the reproductive system almost shuts itself down. So in zoos, they try very hard to kind of mix up, they trade around egg and sperm or actual physical cheetahs so that they can increase the genetic variation as they release them back into the wild. So, I mean, literally, it's like a bottleneck. So if we think about the original population being nice and have a nice variety, but we only shake out a few, then over time it can really change who survives and gets passed on those alleles. And again, this is when species are on the brink of extinction, and sometimes that's when it happens and they disappear throughout. We need the variation to be the foundation of natural selection. When we have lots of genetic options, somebody's going to survive no matter what. There's a much better chance of that. When it becomes so obviously the flip side is correct too, that if it's very shallow, very little genetic variation, if the environment changes, sometimes nobody survives. Last slide. Woo, I made it. The founder effect is if you think about starting a small group, an isolated group of individuals are set aside and they are isolated from one another. Then we see rare alleles occurring in higher frequencies. If you want to think about Darwin's finches, you can think about that those original finches that got blown out by a hurricane from Ecuador, those were the founders of all the genetic information of all the finches that we now see on the Galapagos, right? And so sometimes it works out fine and, they spread out and become different species. But other times, if they are isolated, again, rare combinations of alleles become more common. Amish folks are very exclusive in who they reproduce with and marry, and what we're finding out is there are very rare in the whole population traits that become very common, and including one type of dwarfism, where in the world it's usually about 1 in 1,000, but in Amish communities that recessive trait comes out about 1 out of 14. That's a lot different, and it's because of that founder effect. Perfect timing. Okay, we'll see you next week.